morning, we have 3 special guests here to talk to us about the Cold War. Welcome, Laura, Karen, and Caitlyn. What are your thoughts on the heated dispute going on between the Soviet Union and our America?
So as we all know, after World War II, tensions have rose between the Soviet Union and the United States, and it's impacted the entire world. So we've brought our expertise to your show to discuss this issue going on around our world.
Where did these tensions all arise?
Yes, the United States was pushing for capitalism and the Soviet Union was pushing for communism, and tensions really began to rise after World War II when the Marshall Plan was introduced. And the Marshall Plan was a plan in which $13 billion were provided to war-torn countries in Europe in order to persuade them to go to the side of capitalism.
When the Marshall Plan was put in place, the Soviet Union actually developed their own alternate plan called the Molotov Plan, which was basically the same thing as the Marshall Plan. And this allowed them to push for communism around the world as they influenced other countries and developed their satellite states, and this expanded their sphere of influence.
At the end of World War II, the 2 superpowers, the United States and Soviet Union, emerged after Germany and Japan were defeated. During the Yalta Conference, which was held in Ukraine, Joseph Stalin, Winston Churchill, and Franklin Roosevelt made the decision to divide Germany into 4 occupation zones. 1 for Britain, 1 for America, 1 for the French, and 1 for the Soviets. Each zone gave the European people the right to choose the form of government under which they live. The Truman Doctrine was created by President Truman in 1947. Truman believed that by offering European countries financial aid, those countries would be less likely to turn to communism. It was a form of capitalist expansionism. The United States created alliances with countries such as Greece and Turkey by giving them $400 million in aid. The Truman Doctrine led to the creation of the Marshall Plan, which was initiated by the U.S. Secretary of State, George Marshall. He announced a $13 billion plan to help the Europeans that had been devastated by the war. This was done to not only show the benefits of a capitalist society, but was also done in order to persuade other countries to join. Also, it was a tactic to contain communism within Europe. Now, the Soviet satellite states, Poland, Romania, Czechoslovakia, East Germany, Hungary, and Bulgaria, rejected the Marshall Plan. In response to the Marshall Plan, the Soviets initiated the Molotov Plan. This was essentially the same thing, but to persuade communism instead of capitalism within the European countries. This is an example of balance of power because the Molotov Plan and Marshall Plan strategies were used to equalize strength between the competing Soviet Union and the United States and their differing ideologies.
So, why did these 2 plans create more tensions when they seemed like such good ideas to help Europe recover from the war?
Well, as you can see with both plans, the Soviets weren't ready to let capitalism dominate the world, so they were obviously going to fight back. And they weren't going to allow one superpower to gain more influence over the world than they could, so they would balance out each side by making different plans or counteracting each other's actions.
And this was clearly proven when they put up the Berlin Wall to divide West and East Germany.
So the physical boundary that was created from the Berlin Wall by the Soviets led to the creation of NATO, so the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. And this was created because the United States were concerned for their own safety and also the Allied countries' safety.
And then, of course, the Warsaw Pact was created in a counter-reaction to NATO because the Soviet Union wanted to protect its own allies, which were the Soviet satellite nations.
In 1948, Stalin introduced the Berlin Blockade. This was initiated due to Stalin's fear that capitalism would become evident once again in Germany. To ensure that this would not occur, the USSR blocked all land routes into the western part of Berlin. This was done to prevent the Western countries from sending supplies to West Berlin, which caused West Berlin to fall under Soviet rule. The US, Great Britain, and French did not want to use force, but they still wanted to fly into West Berlin to drop supplies off. They then turned to using airplanes. On average, 13,000 tons of supplies were sent every day. Because Stalin couldn't shoot the planes down without triggering a war, he decided to reopen West Berlin to his allies. Because of the creation of the blockade, the US thought that the USSR intended on taking over Western Europe. Due to this, the US, as well as France and Great Britain, created NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, in 1949. In response to NATO, the USSR created the Warsaw Pact in 1955. This is an example of balance of power, because NATO and the Warsaw Pact were strategies used to equalize strength of the competing Soviet Union and United States and their differing ideologies. The creation of NATO and the Warsaw Pact led to international conflict because countries felt pressured to pick sides, either becoming communist or capitalist.
So, as you all explained, it's clear that the Soviet Union and the US created this extreme competition between each other. Do you think the recent Cuban Missile Crisis that happened only 3 years ago came from this competition?
Oh, most definitely, because since 1947, when the Cold War began, it's obvious that each superpower was trying to get one step over the other person, and it just kept rising, tensions kept going up and up and up, and it had to come to something where someone was stuck between a rock and a hard place, and the world was jeopardized because all the tensions had just kept rising and rising.
So, do you think that it was fair for the Soviets to come to Cuba and put missiles there after the Americans put missiles in Turkey?
I do, because the United States had the missiles in Turkey, and that gave them a step up over the Soviets, because they had missiles there to directly attack them, and the Soviets needed another step up over the United States, so going to Cuba was their best option to do this and scare the United States.
And it's basically the same thing.
Yeah.
Especially with the closeness of Turkey and the Soviet Union and, say, Florida and Cuba.
Yeah.
I get what you mean about the balance of power, like one putting one where the other one in the same proximity, but just because America had missiles in Turkey doesn't mean that Soviet Union should have put missiles in Cuba right away. But the difference is that these Soviet missiles were ready to attack.
Overall, the world was going to come to an end anyway, because both of these countries were pushed in what we call brinkmanship, which means that both these countries were on the verge of their nuclear war.
I think this is the perfect time to go to a commercial break. Thank you everyone for tuning into the Today Show. Next up will be a very important segment on the current Vietnam War.
During the Vietnam War, more than 3 million people were killed in the conflict. 58,000 Americans were included in this number. On average, 1 in 10 soldiers were killed or injured. It was a long, costly armed conflict that pitted the communist regime of the North and its southern ally, known as the Viet Cong, versus South Vietnam and its principal ally, the United States. The war began because of the northern part of Vietnam and its desire to unify the country and become communist just like China and the Soviet Union. The southern part of Vietnam, however, did not agree with this viewpoint and wanted to align the country with the United States and their capitalist values. Since the southern part of Vietnam supported the United States and their capitalist ideas, the United States supported them as well through the providing of military force and weapons. By 1969, more than 500,000 U.S. soldiers were stationed in Vietnam. In response, the Soviet Union and China sent northern Vietnam weapons, supplies, and advisors. The war ended with the United States pulling out because they had already lost and didn't want to admit defeat, so they gave their knowledge and expertise to the southern Vietnamese army, who ended up being defeated by the North, and this led to the unification of Vietnam and caused all of the country to be communist. September 1940, Japan invades Vietnam. May 1941, Ho Chi Minh establishes the Viet Minh, the League for Independence of Vietnam. September 1945, Ho Chi Minh declares independent Vietnam from French rule. And because of this, Vietnam became an ideal battleground for a symbolic hot war between the US and the Soviet Union. January 1950, the Viet Minh received military advisors and weapons from China.
July 1950, the US pledges $15 million worth of military aid to France to help them fight in Vietnam. October 1955, South Vietnam declares itself the Republic of Vietnam. December 1960, the National Liberation Front, NLF, also called the Viet Cong, is established in South Vietnam. March 1965, a sustained U.S. aerial bombing campaign of North Vietnam begins. The U.S. combat troops arrive in Vietnam, and this was initiated due to the creation of the Americans' domino theory. January 1968, the North Vietnamese join forces with the Viet Cong, to launch the Tet Offensive, attacking 100 South Vietnamese cities and towns. The number of U.S. troops in Vietnam reaches 540,000. March 1972. The North Vietnamese crossed the demilitarized zone at the 17th parallel to attack South Vietnam.
January 1973. The Paris Peace Accords are signed that provide a ceasefire. March 1975. North Vietnam launches a massive assault on South Vietnam. April 1975. South Vietnam surrenders to the Communists. July 1976. Vietnam is unified as a communist country, the Socialist Republic of Vietnam. November 1982. The Vietnam Veterans Memorial in Washington, D.C. is dedicated.
The American Army has just requested more troops to aid in the fight against the guerrilla warfare troops in Vietnam. We now take you live to Vietnam, where Kavita Atwal is.
We are just making our way into the middle of the Vietnam War. We're on the other side.
He'll be coming.
Ah! Oh my god! Those people just crossed the 17th parallel! Just about to cross the parallel! And I'm very scared. 1 foot! We've made it over uncharted territory. We are making it to the actual grounds of the war. The sun is setting in Vietnam, but the tensions are just starting to rise. I am standing at the actual war zone where Vietnam is fighting at this very moment. Now, this is not a hot war. I am being shot at this very moment. There may be guerrilla warfare troops here, but I can't see them. I do not want to get killed, but I am reporting the news for you, America. For you. Now, obviously, this war is not a direct conflict between the Soviet Union and the U.S., but the Soviet Union and the United States are using the country to announce... Oh my god! That was a direct shot! I am so scared, America. Ah! I am being